Hello, this is Rabble Radio, recorded on Friday, January 30th, 2026. I'm your host, Brianne Doyle. Rabble.ca shares with you the news of the day through a progressive lens. If you're curious about what's happening in Canadian politics, labor, the environment, and beyond, you've come to the right place. This is news for the rest of us. Thanks for tuning in. Over the last 2 years, Alberta and Saskatchewan have used a special legal power, the notwithstanding clause, to protect laws that affect transgender youth. These laws limit access to gender-affirming healthcare and require schools to get parental consent before using a student's chosen name or pronouns. Critics say these laws break basic rights protected by the Charter and could put transgender and gender-diverse young people at greater risk of harm. This week on Rabble Radio, Layton Journalism for Change fellow Bridget Potasky sits down with Aaden Pearson, trans rights legal fellow with the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. The two discuss the use of the notwithstanding clause across Canada and its impact on 2SLGBTQIA+ rights. Here are Potasky and Pearson in conversation. Take a listen.
Alberta in 2025 passed Bill 9, a series of laws to restrict gender-affirming healthcare for trans youth, laws requiring parental consent for pronoun changes in school for youth under 16, and laws banning transgender girls from participating in female sports. Saskatchewan also passed legislation using the clause to require parental consent for pronoun changes. So my first question for you is, what specific charter rights do advocates say those laws are in violation of?
So those laws would largely be offside of Section 15. So that is our right to equality, specifically that trans and gender diverse youth are being treated differently than, say, cisgender youth. That's the case, for example, like in Alberta, they have banned or restricted gender-affirming care for trans and gender diverse youth, but cisgender youth, for example, still have access to that same medical care. So that's a really clear example of how trans and gender diverse youth would be treated differently than, say, cisgender youth. So that would fall under right to equality. The other kind of clear right that I think is probably at issue here is also our Section 7 rights, which is our rights to life, liberty, and security of the person. And the argument there is that, forcibly outing students to their parents or restricting access to gender-affirming care, which in many cases, it's been shown that to be life-saving care, or restricting trans girls and women from participating in sports can have real implications on our right to life. And that's because we know that forcible outing, as well as lack of access to care, has a lot of implications on mental health and somebody's view of themselves and ability to feel seen and participate within society.
And what kind of position does this put workers in, like doctors and teachers? How does it affect their legal rights and professional obligations?
Good question. It's complicated, right? Because for doctors in particular in Alberta, if they were to prescribe gender-affirming care they're not allowed to prescribe gender-affirming care to youth. And if they were to do so, they would risk fines or imprisonment. And so there is like a real legal question here about whether that is basically criminalizing, if that's basically creating like a criminal prohibition against doctors, which is actually outside the scope of what a province can do. It's only the federal government that can create criminal prohibitions. And so that is one of the legal issues that's going to be at issue, especially in the Alberta case.
And what about teachers? How does this interfere with teachers' abilities to fulfill their professional obligations? Does it interfere with what unions demand teachers do in their profession? I'm just curious about that field as well.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm actually not sure about how it interferes with, say, something like union obligations. I mean, teachers, of course, are obligated to treat students equally and fairly. And so there's a real, I think, argument there to be made that if a teacher is offside of what they would think treating a student equally and fairly, recognizing their dignity, that is, I think it would be more of a moral issue, right? Because they're not actually able to do this, to recognize students according to their chosen name or pronouns if they don't have that parental consent element.
So when the notwithstanding clause is invoked, like it has been in Alberta and Saskatchewan, what sort of workarounds are there to challenge it legally? I believe you mentioned jurisdiction as being one of the issues in regards to criminalizing the practices of doctors. Are there any other kind of avenues to challenge it outside of the democratic process with elections and holding MPPs to account?
Yeah, that's so to start off, like that's kind of the main avenue to challenge sorry, to hold like governments to account when they use the notwithstanding clause is to then go to the ballot box, of course, and then make your voice heard that way. I think what's particularly insidious about this case here, or these kind of cases at issue here, is that the governments have targeted populations that actually can't vote, right? So they targeted youth, so youth are not legally able to vote. And so you've left the population that you're targeting with little to no political power. So that's of course like the main avenue, non-legal avenue to challenge the notwithstanding clause. In terms of these laws, like the Alberta law in particular that has banned doctors from providing gender affirming care, yes, jurisdiction is a legal issue that comes up with this. Is this a proper use of Alberta's legislative power? Are they able to legislate in this way? Or does this basically fall under criminal lawmaking power, which is reserved for the federal government? And if that's the case, the province is then not able to actually pass this law. It would be outside of their jurisdiction to do so. What is happening now in the court challenges, and this is happening outside of Alberta and Saskatchewan, what is also happening around the notwithstanding clause is Quebec right now, they have used the notwithstanding clause to pass a law that basically says that public servants are not able to wear any religious symbols. And so in that case, which is going to the Supreme Court in March, and then as well in the Saskatchewan case, which will also be going to the Supreme Court later this year, the issue then now is basically, since the courts can no longer strike the law down for being unconstitutional because of the notwithstanding clause being used, the legal issue becomes about whether the courts can still hear the case and determine if the law violates rights, even though the court cannot strike the law down, if they do indeed find that the law violates charter rights. So, in other words, the question is whether the court can make a declaration that the law violates rights.
Yeah.
And this is helpful for democratic accountability. It helps with transparency, right? Because it informs the public and ensures that governments are then still politically accountable for choosing to override rights rather than respect them, even though the law is going to operate notwithstanding.
So one thing that I think confuses me as someone who's not, well versed in the law is I know that women have a unique protection from Section 33. It's one of the things that I don't think can be, struck down women's rights, I guess, in a variety of ways from the notwithstanding clause. So how could that, or could that be a possible avenue to challenge these laws when trans girls in particular are the ones who are being like predominantly targeted through laws regarding their participation in female sports? And then in addition, I think there's also an Indigenous element here when we have more of an understanding of Indigenous expressions of gender identity and how that differs from a Eurocentric model. And so our treaty issues, are those in conflict here?
For Indigenous rights, it's a little bit complicated because basically they would have to assert that that there is like a recognized right to, I guess, protection around gender identity within either a treaty or that they would have to have found recognized by a court. And that is a long process that the evidence is unfortunately like very complicated to adduce. Basically, they would have to prove that this has been a right that has been recognized since time immemorial. So, like in terms of like legal recognition, it would be a complicated process to have it recognized. Women are also protected under basically under Section 15, which recognizes basically any sort of characteristic that historically has had disadvantage attached to it. So gender and sex is one of those things, because women have historically been marginalized. But both Saskatchewan and Alberta have explicitly overridden those rights within the legislation that they've passed. And so when they pass legislation, they have to state which sections of the charter they are overriding. So they have explicitly stated the section that protects women.
Got it. So to switch gears a bit, to ask a more broad question, Danielle Smith's government has invoked the notwithstanding clause 4 times in a single month. What threat, if any, does that pose to individual rights in Canadian democracy?
Yes, great question. I mean, the notwithstanding clause, I think, like to kind of just set a baseline here, like it's an extreme tool, and I think you correctly recognize that. It's like a very blunt political tool. There's no other constitutional democracy in the world that has this type of tool. And it's because our fundamental rights are viewed as critical to the functioning of a democracy. So the idea that a government can override those rights is alarming, but that also means that it should be exceedingly rare. So you're right to point out that it's alarming that it was used, multiple times in a month. It was not meant to be a political shortcut in that way. It was designed for exceptional circumstances and as a last resort. But there is this, I think, this trend that we're seeing, like not just in Alberta and Saskatchewan, it's also a big issue in Quebec. There's this increased comfort we're seeing amongst governments to use the notwithstanding clause in order to target minorities. And that should be scary. That should be scary for all of us. There's a reason constitutions protect minorities, and that's because we recognize that the majority population may not always understand the realities and needs of minorities. So by normalizing the notwithstanding clause is used to protect harmful legislation, we're weakening the foundations of our democracy because we're basically saying some people have rights and some don't. It signals a government that's willing to place entire communities outside the protection of the charter. Also, maybe as a slightly separate thought, this doesn't just impact minorities. We also have protections in our constitution against overreach of police powers, freedom of religion, freedom of expression, things that are really fundamental to everyone in Canada, not just minorities. And if governments are increasingly comfortable and willing to override those rights at an increased frequency to advance their own political agenda, I think that's something that all of us and not just minorities should be concerned about.
So this is something that is currently being explored in the Supreme Court by the factum that the federal government submitted. But I'm curious for your perspective on it. At what point is the notwithstanding clause used with such frequency that it amounts to a province amending the Constitution in of itself by making a specific right inaccessible to the population? At what point is that considered a de facto amendment of the Constitution?
Good question. I mean, and this is the government's argument always, is that we have used a constitutional tool that is legal for us to use. And so therefore, if we have made your rights inaccessible, that is a legal thing that we can do. To officially amend the Constitution, it's very difficult. You need all of the provinces to buy into that, provinces and territories. But I think there is a real question that do we truly have a constitutional democracy if large swaths of rights are just inaccessible to certain people? I think that calls that into question. And one thing that's being brought up at the Supreme Court case, in the Quebec case, is, does our Constitution, in the way that it's laid out, because there are other parts to our Constitution besides the Charter and besides the notwithstanding clause, of course, that incorporates certain principles like respect for minorities, respect for rights, does continuously overriding the rights of minorities actually accord with the principles that are in other parts of the Constitution? We will have to wait for the Supreme Court to weigh in on that to find out.
So, gender-affirming care is recognized by health professionals as evidence-based and essential for the mental and physical well-being of many transgender youth. Could you elaborate on why that is the position of medical associations and health professionals?
Yeah. I mean, when we're talking about, in particular, gender affirming care for youth, what we're talking about often is we're talking about, in almost all cases, puberty blockers, which pauses the onset of puberty to allow the young person more time to figure out who they are. It's not common or the case really at all that gender affirming care for youth means surgeries or other things that we've heard in the media and indeed heard from certain premiers of provinces. Without that treatment, you're having life-altering impacts like developing secondary sex characteristics that happen to all of us during puberty. So for trans girls, for example, that means things like developing facial hair, voice deepening. This would be distressing for all young girls and is irreversible. So there is irreparable and irreversible damage that flows out of these laws. The government is saying that they are trying to prevent irreversible damage to young people by limiting their access to healthcare. Okay. This damage is not coming from puberty blockers, which is a safe treatment and is not just used for trans youth, but for a variety of other conditions as well in cisgender youth. And it just the treatment is safe and it helps youth and indeed all trans people see themselves the way that they feel internally. And without that, the impacts are very real that come along with it. And I think it's been well documented within the medical community that the impacts that come along with not having access to this treatment, or indeed not having your name and pronouns recognized, is associated with depression, anxiety, low self-esteem, and just in general, poor life outcomes than if you don't have access to this treatment.
This might be a little bit of a tricky question, but what rights do children have in this country in relation to their bodily autonomy? And then what rights do parents have with regard to the decisions of their children? And how does this legislation interact with that?
Children basically gain rights in terms of their bodily autonomy, as they age. So as they become able to more fully recognize their needs and wants in relation to their body, they essentially gain more rights. And that's in recognition of their ability to make those decisions for themselves. So there's this legal concept called the mature minor doctrine. And that basically says that as a youth becomes more mature and able to make those decisions for themselves, they gain more autonomy over making those decisions for themselves. And those wishes should be respected by the medical, doctors, people, parents, and whatnot. Parents, this is a tricky question. I think what's important in this case is that in these situations where gender affirming care is not, it's basically illegal for a doctor to be able to provide it to a youth. It is illegal despite the fact that this might be a thing that a minor who fully understands the risks, as well as what will be the outcomes of this treatment. The treatment is not allowed to be provided despite their wishes, despite parental wishes who maybe have helped their child make this decision or have been in consultation with the doctors and agree that this is the best thing for their child, as well as it being medically recommended by a doctor. Despite all of this, it is not available to the minor. Parental rights, kind of as an aside, is a bit of it's a tricky subject and it's not entirely clear legally, to be honest.
Got it. I think that's a really important part of this that I feel like I lack a lot of clarity on. So it's good to have that that insight. My last question to you is, are there community organizations that the CCLA has kind of thrown their weight behind in terms of challenging this legislation? And is there anything we could do as just regular community members to support challenges or LGBTQ organizations that are pushing back on the legislation in Alberta and Saskatchewan?
Yeah, for sure. So three groups are actually leading these challenges in Alberta and Saskatchewan. And CCLA is in full support of these groups. In Alberta, it is EGAL Canada and Skipping Stone Foundation, and Skipping Stone is an Alberta not-for-profit who serves queer youth. EGAL is a large organization in Canada that basically also serves more generally just like the interests of queer people. So those two are the ones leading the Alberta Challenge. And then in Saskatchewan, EGAL Canada is also involved in that one, involved in leading that challenge, as well as a group called You Are Pride. And I think what's great is, like supporting those organizations. The organizations, they're not huge, organizations with tons of money. So I think like financial support is never going to go unnoticed. And I think, the other thing is to like try and have your voice heard. So that could be like writing to your MPP to voice disagreement with the policies. There are many, Albertans and people who live in Saskatchewan who disagree with those policies, but those aren't the voices that you're going to hear represented in the media. You're going to hear the voice of the government and, the very vocal dissenters. And so I think, just like speaking up, talking to your MPs, but also just like talking to your friends and family. I think that can also like go a long way. And then of course, financial support is always great.
Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. Have a great day. Thank you.
Yeah, you as well. And also thanks for the great questions. Those were well informed.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Have a good day.
You as well. Bye.
That was Jack Layton Journalism for Change Fellow Bridget Potasky and Aaden Pearson, Trans Rights Legal Fellow with the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. Thanks so much for that, Aaden and Bridget. To learn more about this issue and the recent increase in the use of the notwithstanding clause in Canada, read Potasky's latest piece on Rabble today. And now, this is our In Case You Missed It segment, where we review the top stories from this week on rabble.ca. Here to bring us up to speed is Rabble editor Nick Seabrook. Take it away, Nick.
Thanks, Brianne. Starting with national news. The anonymous three-person NDP Leadership Committee has decided to disqualify Bianca Mugieni's candidacy for the party leadership. The Leadership Committee said that it did so because it believed that Mugieni was not a fully independent candidate. Mugieni's husband, Yves Engler, had previously tried to run for the party leadership and was himself disqualified late last year. After that disqualification, Mugieni announced her intention to run, stating that there were important ideas that needed a voice in the leadership race. Mugieni said that the implication that she wasn't her own candidate was insulting, saying, quote, "It's misogyny, and in this case, misogynoir. The assumption that our voices aren't fully ours, that our leadership must belong to somebody else. I reject that completely. I stand here on my own accord, on my own work, on my own convictions." End quote. Staying with the NDP leadership race, Wednesday, January 28th was the deadline for candidates to apply, and for those who want to vote for the next leader at the convention to buy their memberships. With the deadline now passed, there are 5 official candidates in the NDP leadership race, almost all of whom have been in the race since its beginning last fall. Those candidates are Avi Lewis, Heather McPherson, Rob Ashton, Tennille Johnston, and Tony McQuail. The 3 frontrunners in the race are Lewis, McPherson, and Ashton, who have all received their own significant endorsements. Lewis has received endorsements from unions like the Ontario branch of the Canadian Union of Public Employees and from sitting MP Leah Gazan. McPherson has received endorsements from former Alberta Premier Rachel Notley and former NDP MP Charlie Angus. Ashton, the only Labour leader in the race, has been endorsed by one of the largest private sector unions in Canada, the United Steelworkers. The candidates will all meet at the convention in late March, where the new leader will be chosen. In Labour news, public sector unions warn that government departments are already seeing the consequences of cuts being made by Mark Carney's Liberal government. More than 15,000 workforce adjustment notices have been issued over the last 2 weeks. Employment and Social Development Canada has issued affected notices to about 3,000 indeterminate employees. Thousands more workers received notices at Health Canada, Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, and science-based departments like Environment and Climate Change Canada. Sharon D'Souza, National President of the Public Service Alliance of Canada, criticized the government's approach to the cuts, saying, quote, "Setting a blanket goal of budget reductions for departments without an overview of the entire public service is anything but fiscally responsible. It's reckless." End quote. And finally, in environmental news, the German Physics Society and the German Meteorological Society issued a joint statement saying that global temperatures could be 3 degrees Celsius higher than pre-industrial levels by the year 2050. For years, climate scientists have warned that if global temperatures rose 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, that there would be extreme consequences for life on Earth. David Suzuki says that despite this dire warning, the world already knows what solutions will be best to tackle this challenge, including ending the reliance on fossil fuels and restoring ecosystems that absorb greenhouse gases like forests and restoring peatlands. And as always, you can read the full version of all the stories we talked about today on rabble.ca.
Thanks, Nick. And that's it for Rabble Radio this week. Thanks as always for tuning in. If you like the show, please consider subscribing to Rabble Radio on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please rate, review, share Rabble Radio with your friends. It takes 2 seconds to support independent media like Rabble. If you have feedback for the show, ideas, stories, opinions you'd like us to cover, we'd love to hear about it. Get in touch with us anytime at editor@rabble.ca. Thank you to all the journalists and writers who contributed to this week's content on rabble.ca, and thank you to Carl Narenberg for supplying the music. Lastly, thank you to you for tuning in to Rabble Radio. I'm Brianne Doyle, and I'll talk to you next week.